Before George Washington had a face on Mount Rushmore, the mountain may already have had one. That is the version of this monument people do not like to sit with, because the moment you do, the entire structure changes meaning. It stops being a triumph of sculpture and starts looking like something colder. Not creation, modification, not four presidents pulled from blank granite by artistic force, but a pre-existing form recognized, exploited and overwritten so completely that later generations were taught to see only the final mask. Look at Rushmore long enough, and an uncomfortable question begins to press through the patriotic story. Why this mountain? Out of all the granite in the Black Hills, why this face-shaped wall of stone? The official history is precise about engineering, blasting, drilling, and measurement. It is far less satisfying on the deeper question of selection. Because if the mountain was only raw material, then it was usable. But if it was chosen because something was already there, then the story changes all at once. The accepted version is clean. Borglum saw a massive granite cliff with the right exposure, elevation, stone quality, and symbolic scale. He brought the tools, the ambition, the crews, the dynamite, and the national myth. Over years, the mountain was cut back, shaped, detailed, refined. That version is stable. It keeps the monument inside a safe category: American achievement. Human intention imposed on indifferent stone. But what if Borglum did not begin with nothing? What if what made the mountain useful was not merely its strength, but its suggestion, its proportions, its ridgeline, the way mass was already distributed across the cliff, the sense, visible in early views and difficult to shake, that the workers were not summoning faces out of chaos so much as forcing a new identity onto a form that had already begun to resemble one, not inventing, editing, not making a mountain into a face, but making an older face into something politically acceptable. That is the fracture in the official story. It explains how stone was removed. It does not fully explain why this stone, this wall, this silhouette, this geometry. Hidden history begins exactly there, not where there is no explanation, but where the explanation feels mechanically complete and spiritually evasive. You are told enough to accept the object, not enough to question its inheritance. And Mount Rushmore is an inheritance problem. The Black Hills were never neutral ground. Even in ordinary history, they arrive burdened with prior meaning, prior memory, prior claims older than the nation that later cut its icons into the granite. Overwritten places are almost never empty places. They are selected because something already clings to them: a reputation, a shape, a presence, a story too old to be admitted cleanly into the new one. That is where the mountain starts to feel wrong. Not crude or badly made, wrong in a deeper way. The scale is too resolved, the placement too intuitive. The result aligns too neatly with a recurring pattern in erased history research. Official civilization does not always build from zero. More often, it inherits, renames, recuts, and re-narrates. It takes what is already there and teaches the next generation to confuse revision with origin. That pattern appears in architecture, buried foundations, temporary grandeur, landscapes that seem less constructed than reinterpreted. And if that pattern is real, Rushmore is not an exception. It may be one of its cleanest examples. No one needs to erase an old thing completely if they can make it unreadable. They only need to carve over the parts that would have given it away. Think about the language people use around monuments like this. They say the sculptor found the face in the stone. They say he brought it out. They say the mountain lent itself to the design. Those phrases are treated like harmless metaphors, but metaphor often preserves what the official record smooths over. Found, brought out, lent itself. All of it implies cooperation. All of it implies the mountain was not passive matter, but a structure already carrying a latent form. And that becomes more unsettling when you widen the lens. Mount Rushmore does not stand alone in the imagination of the old world. It sits beside recurring anomalies. Mountains that seem improbably shaped, stone faces reported before formal excavation, giant lore attached to cliff systems and ridge lines, old accounts of beings associated not with houses and cities as we understand them, but with rock-cut spaces, mountain chambers, and terrain itself. In that frame, the question stops sounding absurd and starts sounding dangerous. Not, did someone carve a giant into a mountain, but did later civilization encounter something ancient, face-like, immense, and decide the safest thing to do was to turn it into precedence? To be fair to the official story, Mount Rushmore was not made by illusionists. It was made by men with drills, winches, compressors, jackhammers, suspended platforms, dynamite charges, and years of labor spent removing an almost absurd amount of granite from the face of a mountain. That part is real. The monument did not appear by magic, and the alternative reading becomes weak the moment it pretends otherwise. Stone was cut, tons of it. The engineering was serious, the labor was real. The difficulty was enormous. But none of that answers the deeper question. Proving that a surface was altered is not the same as proving the underlying form began as nothing. The official explanation says Borglum selected Rushmore because the granite was hard, fine-grained, elevated, and exposed to the sun for most of the day. Those are sensible reasons. The mountain was large enough to carry monumental faces and stable enough to hold detail. But even true explanations can be incomplete if they describe suitability without describing attraction. A material can be usable without being inevitable. So the question returns, out of all the usable stone, why this wall, this line, this pre-existing mass that already seems to gather itself into the possibility of a head? That is not a mystical objection, it is a sculptural one. Sculptors do not approach raw matter blindly. They look for where form is already hiding. A natural bulge becomes a shoulder. A ridge becomes a brow. A recess becomes an eye socket. The artist does not create in defiance of the material. He negotiates with it. Once you admit that principle, Rushmore stops looking like a pure act of imposition and starts looking like a negotiation with something already present. That is why some early views of the mountain are so difficult to shake. Not because they prove anything cleanly. They do not. The problem is subtler. The mountain does not always read like a blank plane awaiting invention. It often reads like a damaged giant profile awaiting correction, a forehead already suggested, a nose line already implied, mass already stacked in a way that makes the later faces feel less born than extracted. The official account survives this by leaning on process. Pointing machines, scale models, repeated measurements, controlled blasting, art direction, all important. But process can explain refinement just as easily as invention. A sculptor can use the same tools to reveal a face from chaos or to force a new face onto an older one. The machinery does not settle the origin question. It only settles the modification question. Then there is the problem of subtraction. Through the lens of pure creation, the blasting reads as heroic. Through the lens of overwrite, It begins to look like erasure by adjustment. Cut the ridge, clear the flank, reduce the strange protrusion, normalize the ancient asymmetry, remove what does not belong to the new reading, keep enough of the old mass to support the new face, but destroy enough of its original expression that no one can confidently reconstruct what was there before. That pattern matters because it is how replacement usually works. It does not require total destruction. Leave the mountain standing, leave the ore intact, then give the public a new caption so complete that the previous meaning becomes impossible to hold in focus. Once you look at Rushmore this way, the monument enters the same family as other hidden history anomalies. Structures whose official dates may be accurate for modification but not for origin. Buildings whose renovations are documented while their first conception remains vague. Landscapes that seem to have been completed by modern history, not begun by it. What gets recorded most clearly is often the latest layer, because the latest layer is the one with paperwork. Bureaucracy is excellent at preserving the moment of takeover. It is far worse at preserving what was taken over. If the granite wall was selected not just for strength, but for resemblance, then America's most famous carved mountain may not be a story of origin at all. It may be a story of recognition, followed by controlled replacement. A team arrives. A face-like mass already exists. The nation cannot leave it as it is. So it is given new features, new names, new meaning, and a patriotic frame strong enough to make the prior form unreadable. Not destroyed, reauthored. Once you allow that possibility, Rushmore stops being an isolated oddity and starts behaving like a pattern. A single anomaly can be dismissed as imagination. A suggestive mountain is just a mountain. A face where no face should be is just the mind forcing meaning onto stone. But hidden history becomes hard to contain when separate irregularities begin repeating the same logic across different scales and places. Not construction, but inheritance. Not origin, but reuse. Not the first making of a thing, but the last authorized version of it. That is what makes Rushmore feel less like a patriotic exception and more like a public example of something much older. Because once a civilization learns how to survive by inheriting forms it did not create, it also learns the second skill that always follows inheritance: relabeling. A structure becomes a fair building, a buried lower floor becomes a basement, a megalith becomes a primitive shrine, a mountain face becomes precedence. Same object, new caption. Old meaning cut away just enough to keep it from resurfacing. And when you place Rushmore inside that pattern, another question rises underneath it. If the mountain already carried a face-like form, what kind of world produces that? What kind of forgotten continuity leaves behind shapes so large that later history can only manage them by converting them into symbols? That is where giant lore stops feeling ornamental and starts feeling explanatory. Modern history trains us to think size belongs to myth. The moment something exceeds the normal scale of memory, we move it into folklore to keep the present stable. Giants become fairy tale vocabulary. Mountain beings become exaggeration. Oversized bones become newspaper nonsense. Cliff-cut chambers become ritual sites. Everything too large, too old, too structurally strange gets pushed just beyond admissibility, where it can still be talked about, but never integrated. That may be exactly why the pattern survives. Giant lore has never really disappeared. It only changes register. In one place it appears as stories of tall ancestors. In another, as reports of immense skeletons removed from burial sites and never seen again. In another, as accounts of stone knowledge attributed to vanished builders whose scale no longer fits the surviving population. And in its most unsettling form, it appears not in bones or stories, but in landscape itself, in the suspicion that some features we classify as geology may also be remnants of something biological, petrified, or altered beyond easy recognition. That does not mean every mountain was once a being. The serious version of the question is narrower and harder to dismiss. What if some landforms are not being misseen by alternative researchers, but underseen by official history? What if mountain, in certain cases, is simply the final acceptable word for a shape whose first meaning has been lost? Rushmore matters differently under that light, because the old suspicion is not that someone carved a giant into the mountain. It is that the mountain may have preserved the remains of a giant-like form, already half-legible, already weathered into near geology by time, catastrophe, and partial petrification, and that Borglum's project did not invent significance there. It domesticated it. It took a dangerous face and made it national. It took something inadmissibly old and gave it a 20th century identity clean enough to print in textbooks. That would explain something the ordinary story cannot explain emotionally. Why the monument feels so strangely complete at the level of mass. Even when details are obviously man-made, the deeper weight distribution feels older than the carving. The mountain does not just hold faces, it seems to have been waiting to be read as one. And if that is true, then Rushmore may belong to the same hidden world hinted at in other erased memory fragments. Ancient reports of beings associated with rock-cut dwellings, mountain chambers, subterranean passages, and architectures built for dimensions no modern population would naturally require. Not because those fragments prove anything on their own, but because they keep circling the same missing center. A prior scale, a prior relation between body and stone, a world in which size, engineering, and geology were not separate categories the way they are for us now. That is the real escalation here, not giant mythology as spectacle, but giant scale as explanatory pressure. Because scale changes everything. A civilization built by people our size produces one kind of residue. Doorways, corridors, stairs, chambers, tools, monuments, quarries, all within a predictable range. But a civilization emerging from a larger human template or coexistence with larger beings leaves behind a different logic entirely. Larger architecture, larger landscape interventions, larger tolerances, larger carved volumes, a different relationship between effort and mass. What looks impossible to us may only look that way because we are evaluating it from the wrong body. And suddenly, Rushmore stops feeling like a bizarre leap of ambition in the 20th century and starts feeling like a late-stage modification of a much older scale event. The presidents become a surface treatment. The deeper object remains the mountain itself, and the mountain begins to look less like a blank canvas than a surviving fragment from a world whose dimensions no longer fit the people describing it. That possibility would be easy to laugh off if it only touched one monument. But it does not. It touches the whole recurring intuition behind erased civilization research. That much of what we call modern history is not the first chapter of the world we inherited. It is the cleanup chapter, the naming chapter, the simplification chapter, the chapter in which survivors, institutions, and later states encounter remains too large, too strange, too politically dangerous to explain honestly, and so they do the only thing power knows how to do with inadmissible inheritance. They convert it, they reduce it, they carve over it. If Mount Rushmore was a modification, then the real violence of the monument was never the blasting, it was the renaming. Because destruction is obvious, overwrite is harder to detect and far more effective. It leaves the object standing, it preserves the scale, the awe, the physical fact that something immense is still there. Then it changes only the reading. The public keeps the mountain, but loses the memory. The form survives, the origin does not. That may be why Rushmore feels so stable on the surface and so unstable underneath. Officially, it is one of the clearest monuments in America. 4 presidents, 4 meanings. A national shrine carved into stone. But the deeper you look, the more that clarity starts to feel manufactured. Not false in every detail, but final in a suspicious way. Too final. Too clean. As if the monument did not simply commemorate power, but performed one of power's oldest functions. Taking possession of something older by changing what it is allowed to mean. That is the darker implication here. Not that modern America invented a lie from nothing, but that it inherited something it could not comfortably explain and gave it a safer face. Once you see that, Rushmore stops being just a sculpture and starts looking like a method. A method for how older worlds disappear without vanishing. Not by being removed completely, but by being modified just enough that the next generation mistakes alteration for origin. That is how a buried lower floor becomes a basement. How a reoccupied structure becomes a new building. How a relic becomes an exhibit. How a giant becomes folklore. How a face in the mountain becomes Washington. Because if there really was already a face in that stone, then the presidents are not simply symbols of the nation. They are a replacement layer laid over something the nation did not create. A political mask fixed to geological inheritance. A new expression cut into an older body. The mountain remains immense because the older scale remains underneath it. The monument works because it did not have to begin from zero. It only had to redirect what was already there. The selection no longer feels innocent. The blasting no longer feels purely heroic. Even the finished faces begin to read differently. Not as first arrivals, but as authorized occupants. The granite still carries too much weight, too much pre-existing intention, too much suggestion of an earlier form. The presidents do not fully erase that, they ride on top of it. Which is why the monument still produces a strange reaction people rarely name correctly. It inspires awe, yes, but also a kind of unease that ordinary patriotic sculpture is not supposed to produce. A feeling that the mountain is older than the story attached to it, as if the stone remembers the cut. And this may be the real relationship between modern history and the old world it replaced. Not simple denial, not total fabrication. Something more efficient, selective custody. It keeps the usable fragments, strips them of dangerous context, and hands them back to the public with a date, a dedication, and an official explanation strong enough to stop most questions before they begin. The result is not pure falsehood, it is a managed surface, true enough to stand, incomplete enough to control. Mount Rushmore may be the perfect monument to that process. The upper layer is national mythology, all certainty and granite permanence. The lower layer is something older and less obedient, pressing through in silhouette, in proportion, in selection, in the stubborn feeling that the mountain was not waiting to become a face. It may have already been one. And if that is true, then the deepest achievement of the monument was not artistic. It was psychological. It taught millions of people to look directly at an altered relic and call it an origin story. That is how replacement becomes history. That is how inheritance becomes authorship. That is how a civilization covers its tracks without ever moving the stone. If this changed the way you see the mountain, leave that in the comments before you go. Because after this, Mount Rushmore does not resolve back into a monument. It remains what it may have been all along, evidence of an encounter between two worlds, one remembered, one overwritten. 4 presidents on the surface, something older still holding the weight beneath them. And once that possibility enters the frame, the granite never becomes innocent again. Maybe they did not carve America into the mountain. Maybe they carved the mountain out of America's forgotten dead.